Average Pat's Movie Reviews.
Hi everyone, Average Pat here to sit to chat today about the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. This movie is an homage and a story based on the life of Fred Rogers, being interviewed by a journalist for Esquire magazine. Tom Hanks portrays, ironically, his cousin, Fred Rogers, in a memorable role, and Lloyd Vogel, the reporter for Esquire magazine, is portrayed by Matthew Rhys. This is a very well done trip back into my childhood. I will be dating myself here to admit that I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s, was in high school in the 90s. I grew up on Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street and the Old School Electric Company and shows along those lines. So this one hit very close to home when I heard they were casting it. To see the music, the sets, the persona, the attitude, the love of people that Fred Rogers had, portrayed by Tom Hanks, was a very well done endeavor, and the character is very believable. You expect Mr. Rogers to be there on the screen. Now, obviously, growing up as seeing Fred Rogers, for years, I know it's not him, but the attitude and the embodiment of the love for people that Mr. Rogers showed was very well encapsulated and very well portrayed by Tom Hanks. Being an Oscar winner himself, he knows what to put into his movies. The movie was directed by Marielle Heller, and is very well done and very well set. Obviously, it's a fictionalization. The character of, the different people involved. Matthew Rhys' character, Lloyd, is not, from my understanding, a true character, but to see the story based around him and his experience of going and meeting Fred Rogers. I mean, he's doing a story on Mr. Rogers. He's normally an expose writer, and his wife makes a comment to him when he first announces that he's going to see Mr. Rogers is, "Oh, good God, please don't ruin my childhood." And then obviously that's the same thought most of us had that grew up in my era. Grew up in my age range. This is an icon. This is a god. It's Fred Rogers. All the stories of him being good in person and loving everybody and living out in Pittsburgh, and everybody knows who he was and where he went to and his whole habits, just showed how down to earth he really was. And you don't want something to tarnish that. You want to make sure the movie doesn't ruin something along those lines. And it doesn't. The movie winds up turning everybody into Lloyd on their own. It's a very self-introspective movie, as well as his own introspective movie. The one scene that will stand out and stay with me for some time is they're at a restaurant and he's talking to him and he says, "Lloyd, I want you to do something with me here." And my assumption was that he was going to ask him to pray. He did not. He said, "What I want you to do is just sit silently for a moment and think of everybody who's helped you. Just a minute. And think of everybody who they were and how they've affected you." And literally, everybody else in the restaurant stops. And there is no noise in the theater. Every person in the theater, now it wasn't a very packed theater because it was a late movie, everybody in the theater didn't make a noise either. Nobody was eating their snacks, drinking their drinks. There was no noise for a good solid minute. And that's a long time sitting in a theater at a movie like this. And you have to sit and think, okay, well, everybody else is doing it. Let's start thinking of everybody who's impacted my life. My teachers, my parents, my siblings, my cousins, my friends, extended family, and how they've all impacted my life. And you start to think and realize that, yeah, it's Tom Hanks portraying Mr. Rogers, but the person of Mr. Rogers was living through him. The embodiment of his aura, his way of life, his being, was well captured and portrayed. And in that moment in the movie, Lloyd gets a little overcome with emotion. He stops to think, where is his life gone? Who were the people that mattered to him in his life? Who were the people that made a huge difference? Who were the ones that helped him in life? And how did they affect him? And how was his relationships with those people? His parents, his siblings, his wife, his son, his extended family, his friends, whoever it may be. how did they impact his life? And you see him choked up with a little bit of emotion. And when you stopped and think about it, and you did the same thing yourself, because everybody in the theater did it, including myself, you are overcome with emotion. And you realize this is just the person Mr. Rogers was. He wasn't, going out for the glory. He wasn't doing it to be separate. The one line that Lloyd says to him is, okay, well, what do you really like? Well, there's Fred, that's you, and then there's your character you play. But there really wasn't a character that he plays. Fred Rogers was Fred Rogers. And he did so and came across on television to everybody. That's straightforward. And, one scene that they show is him trying to set up a tent. And it's a humorous moment, but a serious moment at the same time. You watch Tom Hanks trying to struggle to set up a tent by himself, and he can't do it. And it's a good 40 seconds or 30 to 40 seconds of him struggling to do it multiple times, and he can't do it. And he says, I don't think I can do this by myself. And then the scene is stopped recording, and he comes and watches it on the screen and says, okay, let's go with that. And everybody's like, are you sure we can set it up for you? He goes, no, it's fine. It's a scene. It's done. It's well done, and it's there it is. That's exactly what I wanted to have with it. And Lloyd asked him, why didn't you want to have that set up for you? And he said, because I want kids to see no matter what, even if you have plans for it, life doesn't always go out the way adults always want it to. And that was what encapsulated Mr. Rogers. Life was imperfect, and he addressed it head on, and addressed divorce, death, marriage, sadness, handicaps, racism. Fred Rogers never shied away from it and addressed it head on. He broke barriers when he had a black police officer from Pittsburgh come to his show after children had been chased out of the pool in Pittsburgh, PA, by the owner of the pool pouring bleach into the pool to make sure the kids weren't in the pool while other white kids were in there. And he invited him to come on to his show, had a little dipping pool, and asked him to put his feet in the pool with him. That broke barriers. That drove people crazy. But he didn't care because that's what good people do. And he embraced it. And Tom Hanks perceives this and portrays this perfectly, in my opinion. Easily puts him up there for consideration for a Best Actor. The love, the adoration, the respect that he shows, you can't copy that. You can't, even as good as Tom Hanks did it, it wasn't as perfect as Fred Rogers himself would have done. And to see it done and not ruin my childhood or take away from my childhood or take away from any of my memories of growing up with Daniel Tiger and Lady Aberlin and Mr. McFeely and King Friday the 13th. It was fun to see them in flashbacks to my childhood of growing up watching them. The pictures that he shows at the very beginning of the movie were the real Mr. McFeely and Lady Aberlin, and you felt nostalgia. You felt, wow, I remember watching that and seeing them sing and seeing them dance, and you realize that was what Fred wanted to come across, that the world may be imperfect, but it's how you handle it that determines how good a person you are. And Tom Hanks' portrayal of this was perfect. And he embraced Fred Rogers' whole entire style of culture and did it quite well and quite impressively and respectfully. And it didn't ruin my childhood. It actually made my childhood that much stronger. Because I think little things like that helped me grow up. My parents let me watch that. My parents helped me live that way. And despite all the difficulties that I've had in life, my relationship with my parents and my siblings is very good. And a lot of it comes back to Sesame Street and to Mr. Rogers. And watching stuff along those lines. Of course, everybody watched, Bugs Bunny cartoons and Tom and Jerry and, the cartoon violence and stuff along those lines. But the good, wholesome characteristics were brought to the screen by Mr. Rogers and by people like Mr. Hooper on Sesame Street and Big Bird learning all the hard ways with all the great examples of people he had. And television was a whole different beast back then. And this was a good side of TV, and it's perfectly portrayed in this movie. And the love and respect that Fred Rogers shows for everybody involved in this movie, obviously it's an exaggeration of some of it, because Lloyd Vogel was never on an episode of Mr. Rogers, but he seems to be in this movie. It's amazing to see and to realize that this is the type of person he was in real life. I wholeheartedly admit that I love this movie. At the very end of it, there is a clip of Mr. Rogers singing a song, and a picture of him at the end, and his trademark smile that everybody knew. And man, it brought back a ton of memories. It was really neat, really fun, and go see this, man. This is a good movie. It will bring you back to your childhood. It will make you look inside yourself and see where you are in life, and see if you're happy with where you are, and see if there's anything you can do to change it. And it's that powerful. Even as a medium as movie, recreation of the television experience, seeing the set broken down. And I honestly believe, even down to the detail of the closet door that he opens to hang up his his suit jacket and put on his cardigan, I think that was a real, actual door they used. Some of the markings in that door looked way too good to be a recreation. The sweater he uses, my goodness, was handmade by somebody to be perfect like Fred Rogers was. He had handmade second-hand stuff. He wasn't a man of great wealth. He never flaunted it. He raised 2 children of his own. He was a great person with his own flaws, but he handled it as perfectly as he could. And this portrayal and this personification of him and his life was beautifully done, and I can't recommend it enough. Go see this movie. Easily a 5 out of 5. Are there some drawbacks to it? Yes, but I think the good outweighs the bad. The things that got me that were really neat was the sets. Obviously, at the very beginning of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, everybody knows the model set. They used that throughout the movie. They used a set of New York City to show flights going back and forth from New York to Pittsburgh. They showed, stuff along those lines of, trying to show transition between scenes. Was the model sets, and the original music of the intro of Mr. Rogers with the piano. That type of style of music was played in between each transition. The score was done well. It was very powerful and simple, and I can't recommend this movie enough. 5 out of 5. If you enjoy this review, you like it, please let everybody know about it. Like it on Facebook. Subscribe to my page on YouTube. Click the notification bell, and that way you know whenever there's a new review that comes out. And spread the word. Tell your friends and family. Let everybody know that I do these reviews, and see if we can get more people in here to give us more suggestions for movies to go see. I really appreciate all the support you guys have given me. Thank you very much. Have yourselves a great night.